Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to episode 27 of F1 Philosophy. Here we are again without Nicholas. We're sure he is somewhere in Europe, likely shouting into the abyss about how terrible the Hyundai i10 is, and how it is somehow Gunther Steiner's fault. Who knows? Perhaps he is driving out to Gunther's flat to fox-smash his wife. Now on to the work at hand. A few formalities, if you will. You may find us on YouTube at F1 Philosophy, on Instagram at F1_philosophy, and finally drop us a line at f1philosophypod@gmail.com to join our ever-entertaining fantasy league. With that out of the way, how are you, Sean?
Good evening, Gatsby. Thanks for the introduction. I'm doing all right. It's been a busy week. Nothing really to write home about, though. How about you? What have you been up to?
Ah, what a delightfully inquisitive query you pose. Allow me to regale you with my daily tribulations against the furry demon of the foliage, that grand tormentor in the guise of a common squirrel. I, Gatsby, erstwhile guardian of the garden and champion napper of the noontide, have found myself ensnared in an epic grapple with this relentless rodent, henceforth known as Stephen. Picture it, if you will. There I am, in the midst of my morning patrol, inspecting every blade of grass for trespassers and surreptitious scents, when suddenly a rustle from the oak tree overhead. Lo and behold, 'tis Stephen, flaunting his fluffy tail and twitching nose in a manner most unbecoming and altogether infuriating. Day after day he conducts his aerial antics, cavorting from branch to branch, showering me with acorns as if to derisively bestow upon me some woodland knighthood. I posit, dear listeners, that it's not just a rain of nuts, but an unrelenting barrage of impertinence, aimed squarely at my dignity and canine composure.
So that's a lot of words to simply say that you do nothing but chase a squirrel all day. Couple things. We don't have an oak tree out there, so I don't know where he's getting acorns from, but it's not the oak tree that doesn't exist. Anyway, shall we get to it then? Why don't you give us a quick 60-second summary of the Baku Grand Prix from this past weekend?
Task the grand tapestry of the 2024 Baku Grand Prix. Allow me to recount the highlights with the gravitas they deserve. We commenced with the dashing Charles Leclerc at the helm, having seized pole position with considerable aplomb, holding his ground admirably in the opening stages. Meanwhile, young Lando Norris found himself starting from a rather disadvantageous 16th position, having suffered a rather vexing qualifying session. Yet, ever the spirited sportsman, he charged ahead undeterred. Now allow us to turn our attention to the promising young talents, Colapinto and Behrman, who conducted an exemplary performance during qualifying. They manoeuvred splendidly within the midfield, their efforts rewarded by capitalizing on the trials and tribulations faced by Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz. Perez and Sainz, those fierce competitors, engaged in a most vigorous tussle over the final podium position. Alas, in their fervour, they neglected the simplest law of physics. Two automobiles cannot occupy the same space concurrently, resulting in their downfall. And so, in a twist of fate, the astute George Russell found himself gracing the podium, remarkably surprised by this turn of events after what was a rather uneventful outing. Such are the unpredictable charms of our beloved motorsport. A jolly good race indeed.
That was well put, Gatsby, but I think you did leave out a couple of critical points. We saw yet another beautiful drive from Oscar Piastri with an amazing move around the outside of turn 1 to take the lead away from Charles Leclerc. We also saw Sergio Perez put in an impressive effort throughout the race, out-qualifying Max Verstappen and legitimately running in podium contention until, like you mentioned, he conveniently did not see the nearly 2-meter wide red Ferrari in front of him. So, I need to take this opportunity while Nick is not here to give Behrman some credit. As we are all very well aware, Nick has absolutely no capacity to believe that Behrman is a reasonable driver. And I've said it myself that based on his F2 performance, there's nothing to say he belongs in F1. But with that, I think this weekend really proved that he may not be ready in the conventional sense for the fact that he hasn't completed his F2 season. He did have a season last year. That's fair. But we saw an amazing drive from him. The team actually had to get on the radio to him at one point and tell him to push harder because he was conserving too much. And he was still outpacing drivers who have been on the grid for almost 10 years. That is impressive in the Haas. Right? We saw him in Saudi with the Ferrari, one of the better cars in the field at that time, put it in 6th place. And that's what Nick likes to focus on, is that he came in 6th in a Grand Prix winning car, effectively. Well, now we've seen him put it in the points in a Haas. And yeah, Nick will bitch and moan about he wasn't in the points. He was only in the points because Sergio and Carlos crashed, which is fair. But like I've said on this show before, you have to put yourself in a position to capitalize on other people's errors. And that's exactly what he did. He outqualified Nico Hülkenberg, and he finished ahead of him in the points. I'd say he did a great job this weekend. The other rookie, Colapinto, had a relatively uneventful race. He raced really well. He came back from his crash in practice. Didn't let that deter him from pushing on. And he kept it up there, and he got it in the points. And he benefited from Sergio and Sainz crashing as well. But now he's 2 races in, and he's got more points than Logan Sargent has. So I'd say that's a really well-run race for him, and I can't wait to see what the rest of the season holds for Colapinto. The other thing that kind of went unnoticed, let's say, is Danny Rick spent 50 laps on one set of hard tires. I don't know what happened there. Yuki got taken out right at the beginning of the race. Got together with Lance Stroll, some significant damage on his car, ended his race a few laps in. Fine. And I don't know, I think maybe the V-Carb team packed up and went home because Danny was out there for 50 laps. He pitted under the VSC to make his mandatory stop at the end of the race. I don't know if they've given up on him. I don't know if they've just given up on the season, but Baku was definitely one to forget.
Quite right, old chap. I must say I was rather spot on with my prediction that Ferrari would perform admirably at this venue.
Yeah, that's right. You did call it on Ferrari. And I'm sure Nick is not fond of you for doing that, and especially pissed off that you were right. So, why don't we get into it and review the predictions and see where we stood? Okay, so I've got our predictions up here. And we did not do so well this week. So Nick's predictions were from 1 to 5, Lewis, Lando, Max, Oscar, Checo. The only one of Nick's picks that ended up in the top 5 was, 2. Oscar, 3. Okay, I guess I should probably look at these before I start talking. The actual results were Oscar, Charles, George, Lando, Verstappen. So Nick had 3 of 5 of the correct drivers in the top 5, which is not hard to do, but none of them were in the right order. I myself had Perez, Piastri, Max, Lando, Lewis. So close with Piastri in second, but still way off the mark. Anyway, Baku seems to have thrown us all for a loop. P10 though. Nick had Colapinto. So Colapinto outperformed Nick's predictions, which I think we're both happy about. And I chose Behrman just to piss Nick off. And lo and behold, Behrman was 10th. So I get a point there. And then when we look at wild cards, Nick's wild card was no Ferrari engine finishes the race. Well, that wasn't true. We lost one Ferrari engine because of the crash between Sainz and Perez. But other than that, they all finished perfectly fine, no issues. My prediction was actually the opposite. Russell DNFs from a podium position, which ended up being Russell hits a podium position because of a DNF. So that was an interesting turn of events I didn't expect, but there we are.
In essence, it would appear that you and Nick may be somewhat lacking in knowledge on the subject at hand.
Yeah, keep that up, Gatsby, and I might have to put you up for adoption. See how you fare there. Before we move into Singapore, I do want to talk about the Sainz-Perez crash. I have to say it's a great example of the stewards doing their job properly. You know, we've heard a lot of back and forth over the last few years about inconsistent calls by the stewards, inconsistent penalties, inconsistent application of the rules, and that we should be encouraging drivers to fight, and penalizing them for everything hinders their ability to fight because they're afraid of getting penalties and ruining the race. In this case, there was a clear cause for the accident and a clear person at fault for that accident. I'm sure not everybody agrees with my opinion on this, but Sergio is solely responsible for that crash. Carlos was in front. They were both going for the same racing line. Very similar lines that they have taken for the entire race up to that point. The reason that Perez is responsible for that crash is he knows where the front of his car is, and he can clearly see that Sainz is in front of him. Sainz may have been able to see him in his mirrors, but he doesn't have to concede any space to Perez when he's in front of him. Anybody who thinks otherwise is wrong and doesn't understand how a racing driver thinks or how the rules are even written to allow them to go racing. Everybody bitches and moans about, I was ahead at the apex, it's my corner, it's my line. Yeah, you're not wrong. They weren't at an apex, they were on a straight. Sainz was ahead of him. He deserved the space. At any rate, they were fighting over the same piece of track, and they obviously couldn't occupy that same piece of track at the same time, and the result is what it is. The stewards looked at all the data and basically concluded that it's a racing incident. Both drivers took the same lines that they had been taking for several laps before the accident and simply did not want to concede space to the other. No penalties, no further investigation, done. That is how this should be done. And I hope we can see more of this as we go through the rest of the season or the remainder of the season, because this is really what we want to see. Now, with that, I think we should get into Singapore. We want to keep this episode short again. So Gatsby, why don't you introduce Singapore for us?
Certainly this year, all eyes will inevitably be drawn to the illustrious title contenders. Lando and his resplendent McLaren have proven themselves formidable, while the ever-cunning Max Verstappen seeks to defend his championship crown with the unwavering might of Red Bull Racing. With the added layer of Singapore's unique challenges, humidity, carousel corners, and the potential for safety car interventions, the stage is set for quite the tussle. And let us not overlook the brave underdogs, poised to make their mark. Young talents such as Franco Colapinto and the ever-charismatic George Russell are primed to surprise, while veteran stalwarts like Lewis Hamilton, with his wealth of experience, could indeed seize glory among the glittering city lights.
Hold on. The ever-charismatic George Russell? Are we watching the same Formula One? I know you pretend to be British, and frankly at this point I think you probably believe you actually are, but don't buy the British nationalism. George is a whiny little twat who likely won't amount to much, and we've talked about it several times on the podcast here, and I don't want to get into it anymore, but he really isn't what he was promised to be. At any rate, this weekend promises to be another good one. Singapore had an update last year to remove quite a bit of the slow speed third sector in favor of a longer straight into the final complex. This year they've added a fourth DRS zone. So last year there was a conversation about the new straight that was added. That should be a DRS zone to promote overtaking into the final corners. This year they've added it. So this now has 4 DRS zones, which I believe is the most of any track on the calendar. We'll see what that does for us. As a reminder, last year, this is the only track we saw where Red Bull did not win. This is the single outlier in what would have been a perfect season for Red Bull Racing. And that was due to the fact that it's an uneven surface, it's a bumpy surface. They couldn't run the car as low as they wanted to. And that led to all sorts of setup concerns. Effectively, this was a prequel of what was to come from this season. Looking back with hindsight, this race really signaled a direction that was being taken with the car that was going to make it too sensitive. And it seems like, based on certain things the team has said, that this problem started coming in around Spain of last year. And this is something I'll probably get into with Nick once he's back from his vacation. But we now have a lot more information about what's been going on at Red Bull and potentially what is causing the problems. And it's good that they're identifying them. But I think this kind of vindicates Checo's performance. And now that Max is feeling it, I think they're going to have the horsepower to actually go back and fix it. So, last year's race, Sainz won it. And he basically won it by driving at his own pace the entire time, which was a masterful move. He did exactly what he needed to win. It was a very Alain Prost approach. He drove his race, didn't care what was going on around him, drove to a pace that he knew he could maintain, and made himself as wide as possible to not let anybody pass. Effectively, he goaded George Russell into making a mistake, which then took all the pressure off of him. George Russell ended up in the wall. Sainz ended up cruising to victory after basically bottling everybody up behind him. It was a great thing to watch, and it really kind of changed the way some of the Formula One teams have been looking at strategy over the last couple of years, or over the last year, let's say. So hopefully we can see more of that this year. I'm interested to see how the fourth DRS zone potentially changes that behavior. But it'll definitely be interesting now that we have 4 teams capable of competing for a win. I'm really looking forward to this weekend.
This week, we received an inquiry from one of our esteemed listeners regarding the remarkable turnaround of McLaren's performance with their vehicle. Might you be so kind as to elucidate how you believe they accomplished this feat? Additionally, could you share your thoughts on what implications this may have for the upcoming race this weekend?
Sure, I can try and go into it a little bit more. I think it has to do with how efficient McLaren has managed to make their package. And I know I've used this term before, and I'm probably not going to do the explanation any justice. And unfortunately, Nick isn't here to ask questions to probe for more detailed understanding, but I'll do my best. We've talked about previously aerodynamics and what it means. So drag and downforce are not one and the same. You can have drag without downforce, but you can't have downforce without drag. What I think McLaren has effectively done is found the most efficient aerodynamic platform to allow the car to generate as much downforce as they want with the minimal amount of drag. So downforce results in grip. You have a force pushing down on the car. The more force pushing down on the car, the more grip you have, the faster you can go through corners. And because it's aerodynamics, the faster the air moves over the car, the faster you move through the air, the more downforce you generate. If you can find a way to generate that downforce and minimize the amount of drag you add, it's going to be more efficient because you're putting on more grip and minimizing the force pulling you backwards, basically. Or minimizing the resistance to you moving through the air. So it's a very efficient car, and it seems to be an extremely balanced car, which is what Red Bull is currently struggling with. Red Bull had, beginning of last year and in 2022, a very aerodynamically efficient car. This is why the DRS effect was so pronounced on the Red Bull cars when in a straight line next to some of the other competitors, because it had a very efficient aerodynamic platform, and when you open up that rear wing and drop off all the drag created by the rear wing, it had nothing left, no drag left pulling it back effectively. It was much more efficient in doing that than the other designs were. Where Red Bull has now got it wrong is the balance front to back on the car is not right. So there's something happening aerodynamically that's basically decoupling the front from the back, which is a nightmare for a driver because you go in and the car wants to understeer. So it wants to push through the beginning phases of the corner. Doesn't turn in. So you have to force it to turn in. And then as it does, the back end gets unstable and you start to slide. So very unpredictable behavior, very uncomfortable behavior for a driver. That's not what McLaren has done. McLaren has found that sweet spot that Red Bull was chasing. Everybody's chasing fine margins in their development platforms to try and get to a design that does what McLaren currently has. And Red Bull's gone too far down the rabbit hole after making one mistake and allowed it to snowball into where they are now. That's not to say the McLaren car is perfect. It has its fair share of quirks here and there. Obviously, we saw Norris struggle a little bit in qualifying with that car and not being able to hook it up in certain conditions. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely where Red Bull wishes they were right now. So I hope that's answered our listener's question. And if not, feel free to send questions into us either at the email address, on Instagram, anywhere else that you may find us, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. Moving on, we're going to look at the predictions for this week's race. So I have Nick's predictions here, because even though he's on vacation, he still feels like complaining about Formula One instead of enjoying his time off. So his predictions are Checo P1, Lando P2, Oscar P3, Sainz P4, and Max P5. I think that's a pretty reasonable prediction to make. I'm going to say that Checo doesn't hit P1. He's good around the track. He's the only multiple winner at this track, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm going to say that Oscar pulls it out again with another Leclerc P2 and Lando P3. So bear with me while I write this down. I'm going to say Checo takes P4 and Lewis takes P5. Now, for P10, Nick has K-Mag. I think he's going for K-Mag simply because he'll be back on 0 license points and 7 races left, so he's not going to really give a shit and he's going to go for it, which, yeah, he's probably not wrong. I'm going to pick Colapinto. And Nick's outlier is Colapinto crashes out. Not really much of an outlier. What am I going to choose? I think the outlier here is going to be Singapore with no safety car. I think the safety car percentage at Singapore is something like 98.9%. So not having a safety car is definitely going to be a unique experience in Singapore. But I think with the track layout changes, it's made it better for racing, but it's also made it less likely for some of these errors to happen. So we'll see how that plays out. All right. I think that's about it for today. Gatsby, do you have any last words before we say goodnight?
As we draw the curtain on episode 27 of F1 Philosophy, it has been an absolute delight, delving into the intricacies and narratives that have unfolded thus far in this exhilarating season. With the glimmering lights of Singapore beckoning, one cannot help but feel a palpable sense of anticipation for the forthcoming Grand Prix. Will the precision of Ferrari be enough to outmaneuver the relentless prowess of Red Bull? Can McLaren continue their impressive resurgence? As our esteemed drivers prepare to tackle the captivating Marina Bay Circuit, we look forward to the captivating drama that awaits us on race day, where strategy, skill, and a touch of serendipity will reign supreme. Join us in the days leading up to this spectacle, and let's revel in the glorious unpredictability of motorsport. Until then, keep your minds sharp and your engines roaring.
Good night, everyone.